The true horror of the Chinese silk torture was not the pain, but the sound. For the noblewoman inside, silk had been the language of her life. It whispered her status with every step, the rustle of fine threads, a constant reminder of her place in the Tang court. That same luxury now formed her tomb. The finest imperial bolts, once her armor of privilege, were now the weapon of her undoing. A court of silent onlookers watched the hours-long process. You could hear their sharp, collective intake of breath as each new layer was added. The only sound was the dry whisper of fabric, punctuated by the victim's strained, useless gasps. The pressure built slowly, deliberately, first the limbs, then the torso, a relentless constriction that stole the air. Her human form began to disappear beneath the gleaming cocoon. This was not a swift execution. It was a meticulous, psychological erasure, and as the final length of silk was pulled across her face, plunging her into a world of crushing darkness, one question remained. How did it come to this? How does a woman of such power end up here, suffocated by the very symbol of her prestige? The answer is a story of rivalry, betrayal, and a cruelty so refined it became an art form. But you must ask, how did the ultimate symbol of rank become the state's most intimate weapon? And why was this psychologically devastating fate reserved only for the most powerful women in the Tang Dynasty? The answer begins with the Empress, who perfected this very specific form of terror. The sound of the Tang court was a living thing. A low river of murmurs flowed through the grand hall, punctuated by the soft percussion of silk robes shifting against polished stone floors. Hundreds of the empire's most powerful men stood in their prescribed places, their voices a constant, humming undercurrent of statecraft and gossip. Then, that river of sound would just stop. A sudden, sharp silence would fall, so absolute you could hear a single sleeve brush against a wooden pillar from 100 paces away. That is how you knew she had entered the room. Her name was Wu Zetian, and she was the empress who had taken the dragon throne for herself. She was not born to rule. She had been a concubine, a pawn in the schemes of others, until she outplayed every single man who stood in her way. She climbed a ladder of knives to reach the top, and she knew that every hand below her was waiting for a chance to pull her down. This knowledge coiled in her gut, a constant, cold serpent of paranoia. She never listened to the words her ministers spoke. She listened to the spaces between them. She watched the subtle tightening of a jaw, the flicker of an eye, the faint tremor in a hand holding a formal petition. For Wu Zetian, the throne was not a seat of comfort. It was a battlefield she occupied alone, surrounded on all sides by men who smiled at her face while praying for her demise. Her power was absolute, yet it was also fragile. It rested on a foundation of fear she had to rebuild every single day. One moment of weakness, one misplaced trust, and the whole edifice would crumble into dust. She knew the whispers that followed her through the palace corridors. They called her a usurper, a demon, a woman who had defied heaven itself to seize a power meant only for men. She didn't just survive this poison. She mastered it. She forged it into a weapon. Wu Zetian created a network of secret police that spread through the capital like a silent plague. A careless word spoken in a tea house could mean a visit in the dead of night. A powerful general, who seemed too popular with his troops, might simply vanish, his post filled by a new appointee before the sun rose. No one ever saw the evidence. No one heard a trial. There was only the chilling, empty space where a person used to be. This was how she held the empire together. Not with laws written on scrolls, but with a terror that was felt in the very air people breathed. She was more cunning, more decisive, and more ruthless than any emperor before her. She had to be. But her genius was in understanding the different kinds of threats she faced. An ambitious general was a simple problem. A border dispute was a matter of logistics and steel. These were masculine threats, to be met with masculine solutions. Wu Zetian recognized that the attacks on her legitimacy were different. They were subtle, social, and often led by the very women who should have been her allies. The noble ladies of the great clans, the wives and mothers of the powerful men she dominated, they were the ones who could truly undo her. They commanded a different kind of army, an army of whispers, reputation, and influence. A well-placed rumor could do more damage than 1,000 soldiers. And to fight this kind of war, she needed a new kind of weapon, one that didn't just break the body, but annihilated the soul. But the soldiers at her borders were not her greatest fear. The real threat was closer. It wore fine silk, spoke in whispers, and resided within the palace walls. A high-born woman in the Tang court could, on her own authority, divorce her husband. This was not some dusty, forgotten law on a scroll. It was a tangible expression of a power that made Empress Wu's blood run cold. These women were not chattel. They owned land. They managed vast family estates, their signatures moving fortunes in grain and silver. The dry scratch of their calligraphy brush on a deed was the sound of a clan's destiny shifting. A husband might hold the public office, but it was his wife's command of the household treasury that funded his ambitions and paid his soldiers. And this economic independence gave them a voice that echoed through the highest chambers of government. They were not educated to be merely ornamental. They were trained to be strategists. In their private gardens, over the soft clink of porcelain cups, they debated politics and philosophy. Their praise could launch a court official's career. Their casual, cutting remark, delivered with a smile, could end it just as quickly. They commanded networks of information that rivaled the Empress's own spies. The whispers passed between ladies in waiting during the morning toilette contained more state secrets than any formal report. They moved through the suffocating etiquette of the court not as delicate flowers, but as masters of a brutal game. Every social gathering was a battle. An alliance was sealed with the gift of a rare perfume. A rival was hobbled with a perfectly timed, embarrassing rumor. The arranged marriages of their children were not family matters. They were corporate mergers, consolidating power and wealth into impenetrable blocks. The gentle chime of jade ornaments as they walked in procession was the sound of armies taking their positions on the field. They understood, just as Wu Zetian did, that true power was not always wielded with a sword. Sometimes it was wielded with an invitation, or the lack of one. They were playing her game, just with different pieces. The Empress saw it all. She saw the loyalty these matriarchs commanded. She saw how ministers who defied her would flock to their salons, seeking protection and an alternate source of patronage. These women were not just thorns in her side. They were a parallel center of gravity, pulling the court apart, challenging her absolute authority with every poem they composed and every party they hosted. They represented the old aristocratic bloodlines who saw her as a low-born usurper, and they used their immense social standing to remind everyone of that fact every single day. Wu Zetian knew she could not simply have them arrested. A public trial would turn them into martyrs and unite the great clans against her. A quiet assassination would spark a blood feud that could tear the empire in two. She needed a weapon that was uniquely suited to this unique enemy. She required a method that did not just kill the body, but publicly dismantled the very identity that gave them their power. Their influence was built on their untouchable elegance, their flawless reputation, and their immaculate presentation. The foundation of that entire identity was silk. It was their uniform, their flag, the glittering skin they showed the world. These women saw silk as their armor and their birthright. They had no idea the Empress was about to turn it into their tomb. The most effective weapon isn't one that breaks bones. It is one that breaks the soul. Wu Zetian understood this in a way her male generals never could. They thought in terms of armies and sieges, of blades and blood. Their solutions were loud, messy, and obvious. The Empress knew true power lay in silence, in precision, in a cruelty so perfectly tailored to its target that the victim becomes an accomplice in their own destruction. She watched the great ladies of the court, not with fury, but with a cold, terrifying clarity. She observed the way they moved, the way they held their heads, the way the very air seemed to part for them. Their power was not in what they did, it was in who they were, and she was about to take that away. Her plan began with a sound, the constant dry rustle of silk that filled the women's quarters of the palace. It was the sound of their identity. Each woman was a walking testament to her clan's fortunes, draped in hundreds of yards of the most expensive fabric on earth. They wore their status like a second skin, a glittering carapace of brocade and gauze that declared their importance without a single word. It was their shield. It was their voice. It was the source of their unassailable pride. Wu Zetian listened to this sound, the constant whisper of their collective arrogance, and she heard the blueprint for their undoing. She would not strip them of their finery. She would bury them in it. The concept was an act of pure psychological demolition. An execution by sword is an attack on the body. This would be an attack on the very concept of the self. A noblewoman's entire existence was defined by her elegance, her poise, her form. The meticulous art of her presentation was the foundation of her influence. So, Wu Zetian designed a death that would systematically reverse that art. The process would not be hidden away in a dungeon. It would be a public ceremony, performed in full view of the court. The victim would be forced to watch her own identity be unmade, layer by excruciating layer. It would start with her limbs, the instruments of her graceful movement, bound and immobilized. Then her torso, the core of her posture and pride, would be compressed, stealing her breath and her dignity. Every element was chosen for maximum symbolic impact. The weapon would be their own signature treasure, the finest imperial silk, taken from the imperial stores. The men applying the silk would not be brutish executioners. They would be the very artisans who wove the fabrics, their skilled hands performing a horrifying parody of their usual craft. Each bolt of silk added would be another weight, another turn of the screw, pressing in, silencing, and slowly erasing the human shape beneath. The goal was not pain, though the pressure would become unbearable. The goal was transformation, to take a woman who was the pinnacle of refined society and turn her into a shapeless, silent, helpless object. She would still be alive inside. She would hear the gasps of the onlookers who once admired her. She would feel the crushing weight of the very thing that once made her beautiful. The rustle of the silk, once the sound of her power, would become the sound of her tomb being built around her, thread by thread. This was not a punishment meant to deter treason. It was a lesson designed to burn itself into the mind of every other noblewoman who watched. It was a message, delivered with chilling theatricality. Your status, your name, your very humanity is a gift from me, and I can take it back whenever I wish, using the very things you hold most dear. This was a terror far deeper than the fear of a quick death. It was the fear of total annihilation, of being unmade, of having your legacy and your name swallowed by a gleaming, beautiful cocoon, leaving nothing behind but a silent monument to the Empress's absolute power. It was the perfect weapon for a very specific war. It targeted the enemy's greatest strength and turned it into the instrument of their complete and utter ruin. The weapon was designed. The theory was sound. All that was needed was a first victim to make an example of, and the Empress knew exactly who it would be. Before the silence of the cocoon, the court echoed with the name of Lady Jiang. Her name was spoken not in the clipped, formal tones of official business, but with a warmth that was deeply personal. You could hear it in the way ministers would pause their political maneuvering, turning to her with genuine smiles to ask her opinion on a new verse of poetry. Her laughter was a sound that could cut through the thick, perfumed air of the palace, a ripple of authentic joy in a place that rarely heard it. She possessed an effortless grace that drew people to her. When she moved through a room, a soft murmur of affection followed in her wake, the rustle of 100 silk robes turning in her direction. She was not just a powerful noblewoman among many. She was the sun around which the social world of the court revolved, and every ray of that light cast a shadow that fell directly upon the dragon throne. The Empress's spies brought her reports that were chilling in their detail. They did not speak of armies or plots. They logged the phrases of praise spoken about Lady Jiang in the tea-houses. They described how younger ladies of the court copied the precise angle of the jade pins in her hair. They noted which powerful generals sought her company at banquets, laughing a little too loudly at her stories. Wu Zetian saw this for what it was, a transfer of allegiance. Every ounce of admiration given to Lady Jiang was an ounce of fear and respect stolen from the Empress. Lady Jiang was building a kingdom of hearts, a realm where Wu Zetian's authority could not reach. She never asked for this power. It flowed to her naturally, That innocence was precisely what made her the perfect target. She had to be removed, not as a traitor, but as a rival star in the sky. The summons arrived on a morning just like any other. Lady Jiang was practicing calligraphy, the only sound in her chambers the soft scratch of her brush on rice paper. Then came a new sound, the heavy, rhythmic slap of military boots on stone floors. The Imperial Guard. Her ladies-in-waiting went still, their hands frozen in the middle of sorting silks. The guards did not offer a polite request. They held a lacquered scroll bearing the Empress's seal. Lady Jiang rose, her composure an immaculate piece of armor, and followed them from her private world into the public court. The great hall was already full, but a dead, unnatural quiet pressed in from all sides. The ceaseless river of court gossip had been dammed. Hundreds of officials stood like statues, their eyes fixed on the empty throne. They had been gathered to witness a piece of theatre. A eunuch stepped forward, his soft shoes making no sound. He unrolled the imperial decree, the sharp crackle of the parchment startling in the thick silence. He began to read. He did not speak of conspiracy. He did not list crimes against the state. The accusation was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. It accused Lady Jiang of insincere elegance and the cultivation of a false reputation to steal the affections of the court. It was an indictment against her very being. She stood frozen, listening to this impossible charge. They were condemning her for being liked. They were punishing her for the crime of being herself. Her mind reeled, trying to form a defense against an accusation that had no substance, no evidence, no logic. She turned her head, her eyes sweeping across the familiar faces of the court. She searched for the men who had praised her intellect, the women who had called her a friend. She found nothing. No one would meet her gaze. She saw only the tops of bowed heads, the rigid lines of their backs. In that sweeping, terrible silence, she could suddenly hear the faint rustle of her own sleeves, a sound that once meant power, now a lonely whisper in a room that had already become her tomb. She understood. This was not about her at all. This was a message for them. The terror that seized her then was cold and absolute. It was not the simple fear of death. It was the horrifying realization that her identity, the sum of her entire life, was being publicly dismantled and declared a fraud. The eunuch snapped the scroll shut. The guards seized her arms, their grips like iron. They started to drag her away, her fine silk slippers making a soft, shushing sound on the polished floors. She was being erased. With a final, desperate surge of will, she wrenched herself around to face the court one last time. Her voice, when it came, did not tremble. It was the clear, commanding voice of a woman born to rule her own destiny, even at its end. As she was led away, she didn't beg for mercy. She begged for a clean death, a warrior's death by the sword. But the Empress had something far slower and far more instructive in mind. The torture did not begin with pain. It began with a sound, the sharp, violent rip of fine silk robes tearing away from a noblewoman's body. The guards did not bother with the intricate knots or the delicate jade clasps that held her layers of clothing in place. One of them grabbed the embroidered collar of her outermost robe, a garment worth a small fortune, and he simply pulled. The sound that followed was a shriek of snapping threads, a sound that made the entire court flinch as one. It was the sound of a life's work of poise and presentation being destroyed in a single brutal second. They were not just removing her clothes. They were shredding her identity. Another guard took hold of her sleeve, a masterpiece of gauze so fine you could read a scroll through it, and tore it from shoulder to wrist. Lady Jiang made a small involuntary sound, a choked gasp of disbelief. This was a violation deeper than any blade could deliver. For a woman of her station, to be seen in a state of disarray was a social death. To be forcibly stripped naked in the great hall was an erasure of her very humanity. The court watched in a state of horrified, absolute silence. You could hear the rustle of the ruined silk as it pooled around her feet. You could hear the guard's heavy breathing as he ripped away the next layer. Her entire existence had been a performance of flawless composure. Now, that composure was the only thing she had left. She refused to struggle. She stood ramrod straight as they tore away the brocaded vest. Then, the underrobes, each one a different color, a different texture, a different memory. With each piece of fabric that fell away, she felt a part of herself fall with it. The stares of the ministers and ladies felt like physical blows, 1,000 invisible hands touching her, judging her, stripping her of the last vestiges of her dignity. She was no longer Lady Jiang, the poet, the strategist, the center of the court's affection. She was becoming an object, a thing to be observed. They worked with a methodical, unhurried cruelty that was clearly rehearsed. Rip, a collective intake of breath from the assembled nobles. Rip, the soft whisper of another ruined garment falling to the stone floor. Lady Jiang's world shrank to the sensation of the cold air on her newly exposed skin and the sound of her own controlled breathing. She kept her eyes fixed on a distant pillar, refusing to look at the faces of the people who had once been her friends. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Not yet. She could feel a cold tremor starting in her legs, an animal fear that threatened to shatter her iron will. Then it was over. The last scrap of silk lay in a colorful, pathetic heap around her bare feet. A profound and terrible stillness descended on the hall. The tearing had stopped. The guards stepped back. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sight of this woman, this icon of Tang elegance, standing utterly exposed before the silent, watchful eye of the state. She was a ghost of her former self, stripped of every symbol that had defined her. Her power, her name, her reputation, all of it had been ripped away and thrown to the floor like so much trash. She shivered, not just from the cold of the great hall, but from the chilling finality of her social execution. This, she thought, must be the end. But the Empress's design was far more meticulous than that. Stripped of her rank and her dignity, she stood shivering. But the true horror was only just beginning, as the first layer of wet, cold silk was brought forward. The sound that came next was almost silent, a soft, wet slap. An artisan, his face a mask of professional detachment, laid the first length of soaked imperial silk against Lady Jiang's bare ankle. The shock of the cold was instant, a jolt that ran up her spine, but she refused to give it voice. He began to wrap. The water acted as a lubricant, allowing him to pull each layer with a tautness that dry fabric could never achieve. This was not the work of a clumsy brute. It was the precise, practiced application of a terrible science. A second artisan started on her other leg, a third on her arm. They moved with the quiet efficiency of weavers at a loom, their motions a horrifying mirror of their life's work. The only sounds were the soft, slick whisper of the wet cloth and the steady, shallow rhythm of Lady Jiang's breathing. This was a death engineered by scholars. Monastic scrolls, usually filled with philosophical truths, contained different notes for the Empress's executioners. They detailed the physics of drying fibers. Silk, when wet, could be stretched. As it dried, its threads would contract with an inexorable, crushing force. The notes specified the ideal water temperature. They even calculated the effect of the great hall's ambient humidity on the duration of the process. On a dry day, the contraction would be swift, a merciless vice grip closing over 6 hours. On a damp, humid day, the agony could be extended, drawn out over 18 hours of slow, deliberate compression. The Empress could choose the pace of her victim's demise by simply reading the air. The artisans were not just wrapping a body, they were setting a clock. From Lady Jiang's perspective, the first sensation after the cold was a spreading numbness. She tried to curl her toes and found she could not. The feeling was simply gone. The wet silk was already beginning its work, cutting off the flow of blood to her extremities. They reached her knees, then her thighs, winding the gleaming fabric in a flawless overlapping pattern. She was being transformed into a statue, her limbs locked into a single, rigid position. She could feel the weight building, each new layer adding to the suffocating burden. She could also feel the first hints of the pressure, a deep internal ache in her bones as the threads began their microscopic, fatal contraction. Her body was becoming a cage, and the bars were tightening. The artisans moved to her torso. This was the most critical phase. They wrapped the silk horizontally, across her ribs, leaving her arms pinned to her sides. With the first circuit around her chest, she felt a change in her breathing. A full, deep breath was suddenly impossible. Her diaphragm met a wall of unyielding, wet fibre. She could only take short, shallow sips of air. The men worked methodically, their knuckles occasionally brushing against her skin, their focus absolute. They were not torturers in their own minds. They were craftsmen completing a difficult commission. Lady Jiang closed her eyes, trying to retreat into her own mind, but there was no escape from the physical reality. The pressure was a living thing now, a serpent coiling around her ribs, squeezing a little tighter with every passing minute. She could hear the faint, almost inaudible sound of the silk beginning to dry. It was a soft creaking, like the rigging of a ship under strain. The fibres were shrinking, pulling taut, their molecular structure reasserting itself. The ache in her bones deepened into a grinding pain. The pressure on her chest made every desperate gasp for air a colossal effort. Her vision began to tunnel, the edges of the great hall blurring into a dark haze. She was still entirely aware, her mind a sharp, clear point of light in a failing body. She could feel the subtle shift in temperature as patches of the silk lost their dampness, their grip becoming like iron. The victim was fully conscious, feeling every fibre tighten. She could do nothing but wait as her own beautiful adornment became a cage of unyielding thread, and she was still hours from death. A sharp, wet retch cut through the silence. It was followed a moment later by the soft, heavy thud of a body hitting the polished stone. No one turned. No one dared even to glance in the direction of the sound. To look away from the spectacle in the centre of the hall was to admit weakness, to admit empathy. And in the court of Wu Zetian, empathy was a form of treason. Their orders had been simple and absolute. You will stand, you will bear witness, you will watch until the end. This was not an execution for the benefit of the condemned. It was a lesson for the audience. The noblewomen felt it most acutely. They stood in their designated rows, a silent forest of silk and jade, their faces pale masks of forced composure. Each woman could feel the fine weave of her own robes against her skin, a sensation that had always meant comfort and status. Now, it felt like a death shroud in waiting. A cold sweat trickled down the spine of the Lady of Wei. Her hands clenched so tightly inside her long sleeves that her fingernails bit into her palms. She could hear the shallow, terrified breathing of the woman standing next to her. She could smell it, too. That was the other sound that began to fill the hall. A series of faint, desperate clicks. The sound of jeweled cosmetic boxes being opened. Ladies fumbled for their perfume powder, patting the scented dust onto their necks and wrists with trembling hands. The air grew thick with the cloying sweetness of jasmine and rose, a frantic attempt to mask the raw, animal smell of fear that was rising from their ranks. But the perfume could not cover the truth. Lady Jiang was not an anomaly. She was a warning. She was a mirror. Every woman there saw her own face in the silent, cocooned figure. They understood with a clarity that froze their blood, that their influence, their wealth, their very lives were held on a leash. And the Empress was showing them all just how short that leash was. They had all admired Lady Jiang. They had copied her style of poetry, sought her advice on arranging marriages, and laughed at her wit. Her effortless grace had been the standard by which they all measured themselves. Now that same grace was being systematically dismantled before their eyes. The slow, relentless pressure of the silk was crushing more than a body. It was crushing an idea, the idea that a woman could hold power through respect and affection, rather than through sheer, brutal force. The message was being written in contracting fibres of silk. There is only one sun in this sky. There is only one centre of gravity in this court. A few of the younger women began to sway, their eyes rolling back in their heads. Their ladies in waiting, standing behind them, would subtly prop them up, a hand on the small of their back, a whispered command to breathe. Fainting was not permitted. This horror had to be seen, had to be absorbed, had to be remembered in perfect, agonizing detail. The slow process forced them to confront the mechanics of the cruelty, to internalize the cold genius of it. This was a fate worse than a quick, clean death by a blade. This was a public unmaking, a slow descent into a state of living burial. The Empress wasn't just watching the victim die. She was watching the faces in the crowd, ensuring her message of absolute control was being received by every single one of them. Give me a sword. Let me die a warrior's death. Do not let me be trapped like prey in a spider's web. The voice of Lady Chen cut through the thick ceremonial silence of the great hall, clear and without a single tremor. She was not the beloved socialite that Lady Jiang had been. Her power was of a different kind. You could hear it in the way she spoke, a directness that bordered on the martial. Her family were generals. Her ancestors had carved the empire's borders with steel, and she carried herself with the same unbending posture. Now, stripped and standing before the throne, she made her demand. She did not plead for her life. She was pleading for her death. The entire court held its breath, waiting for the Empress's reply. To grant her a sword would be an acknowledgement of her status, of her warrior heritage. It would be a quick, almost honorable end, an execution for an enemy of the state. But Wu Zetian was not in the business of executing enemies. She was in the business of dismantling them, piece by painstaking piece. Lady Chen's request was the ultimate defiance. She was trying to choose the terms of her own destruction, to seize one final scrap of agency in a room designed to strip her of it entirely. The silence that answered her was more profound, more damning, than any spoken word. The Empress did not even move. This was the genius of the cruelty. It anticipated defiance. It fed on it. Lady Chen's strength, her refusal to break, simply made the lesson more potent. She was demonstrating the exact thing Wu Zetian wanted to extinguish. The idea that a noblewoman's will had any meaning at all. You could almost feel the collective hope of the onlookers die in that silence. They saw a woman who refused to be a victim, and in the next moment, they saw the futility of that refusal. Two artisans stepped forward from the shadows. They did not carry a whetstone or a polished blade. They carried the first bolt of wet, gleaming imperial silk. The rustle of the fabric being unrolled was the only reply she would ever receive. Her words, trapped like prey in a spider's web, hung in the air, a perfect, horrifying description of what was about to happen. A sword is an event. It is a single moment of finality. A web is a process. It is a slow, methodical construction of a prison, built from the very substance of its victim's world. Lady Chen understood this on a primal level. The horror was not in the dying, but in the waiting, in the feeling of the first cold thread against your skin, knowing the thousands that were to follow. It was the terror of being immobilized, of feeling your strength become useless, of being slowly compressed into a helpless, shapeless thing, while your mind remained perfectly, screamingly clear. She had asked for a warrior's death. What she was given was an entomologist's execution. They started at her feet, just as before. The cold shock of the wet fabric. The first, tight wrap around the ankle. But unlike Lady Jiang, Lady Chen fought the numbness with her mind. She focused on the feeling in her toes, trying to keep the sensation alive. A tiny, futile act of rebellion against the inevitable. She watched the artisans work with a focused, burning intensity. She memorized their faces, the pattern of their movements, the way they expertly pulled each layer taut. She would not close her eyes. She would not look away. She would bear witness to her own unmaking. The pressure began its slow, inexorable build. The second layer went on, then the third, each one adding its own infinitesimal squeeze to the whole. The sound of the slick fabric was a constant, whispering torment. It was the sound of her plea being ignored. It was the sound of the spider, patient and tireless, spinning its threads. She could feel the blood flow slowing, the deep ache beginning in her bones. And still, she stood rigid, her chin held high, her eyes locked on the impassive face of the Empress on the throne. She was trying to turn her own torture into a contest of wills, a staring match across the abyss. She did not yet understand that in this contest, her will was the very thing the machine was designed to crush. Her plea was, of course, denied. The point wasn't to kill her quickly. It was to make her death a lesson in helplessness, a lesson that was about to be burned into the memory of the court forever. You would think a torture this horrific would be banned for being too cruel. You would be wrong. It was banned for being too effective. The very memory of it became a sickness a lingering poison in the palace corridors long after Wu Zetian was gone. The emperors who followed her inherited a court that gave perfect obedience. But this was the rigid stillness of a corpse, not the vibrant loyalty of a living state. Ministers spoke only when spoken to, their proposals stripped of all daring or innovation. The engine of government had seized, choked by a fear that had seeped into its very gears. The spectacle of the cocoon had done its job too well. It had not just broken the will of a few noblewomen, it had fractured the soul of the entire ruling class. This trauma was a ghost that haunted every state banquet, every council meeting. A minister would catch the whisper of his wife's fine silk sleeve and flinch with a memory that was not his own. The sound had been permanently corrupted. It was no longer the sound of wealth, but the echo of a slow, crushing death. A new emperor could not rule a court that was paralyzed by its own history. Every powerful woman, every ambitious consort, was now viewed through the lens of this terrible potential. The silk cocoon became a weapon that threatened the very stability it was designed to enforce. It had to be removed from the imperial arsenal, not for mercy, but for the survival of the throne itself. The decision was not proclaimed from the dragon throne. It was made in quiet chambers, a desperate act of political medicine. The new emperor saw the terror in the eyes of the court ladies, even those in his own family. He understood that a weapon that makes everyone afraid of everyone else will eventually destroy the one who holds it. An imperial decree went out, its language deceptively simple. The practice was forbidden. But the order went much further, commanding an act of historical vandalism on a massive scale. The emperor's scribes were dispatched to the imperial archives with a new, chilling task. They were not there to record history, they were there to delete it. You could almost hear the silence of their work in the dusty scroll rooms. The only sounds were the soft scrape of a sharpened bone knife erasing a character from a bamboo slip, or the whisper of a brush painting over a line of damning text on a silk scroll. They worked under guard, late into the night, their faces lit by the low flame of oil lamps. They were surgeons, cutting a tumor out of the official record. Every mention of the silk cocoon, every reference to a death by constriction, was to be expunged. The names of its victims, women like Lady Jiang and Lady Chen, were not removed from the ledgers. That would leave a hole. Instead, their fates were meticulously rewritten. A sudden, tragic illness claimed one. A quiet accident while traveling took another. Plausible lies, supported by forged physicians' reports and travel logs, were carefully woven into the grand tapestry of the dynasty's history. The goal was to create a seamless, sanitized past. A past where this specific, intimate horror had never been conceived, let alone practiced. It was a systematic attempt to convince the future that the empire had never been capable of such a thing, to wash the blood from the silk. The official silence was meant to be absolute and eternal. Archives containing the original unaltered accounts were bound in thick leather and stamped with imperial seals of wet clay, never to be opened on pain of death. These scrolls were not burned. Fire was too theatrical. It invited questions. Instead, they were buried alive in the bureaucracy, condemned to be forgotten in the deepest, darkest vaults of the palace library. The heavy groan of those stone doors closing on the truth was meant to be the final sound in the story. The state had declared its own collective amnesia, hoping the wound would scar over if no one was allowed to speak of it, and for a time the silence held. A generation grew up knowing nothing of the cocoon, except through the most fearful whispers passed between women in their private quarters. The story detached from fact, its edges blurring. It became a dark fable, a cautionary tale that mothers told their daughters about the price of ambition. Court scholars, reading the new, flawless histories, found no evidence of it at all. They dismissed the rumors as peasant superstition that had somehow crept within the palace walls, a ghost story unworthy of serious consideration. The perfect psychological weapon had been followed by a perfect psychological cover-up, burying the trauma under layers of official denial. For centuries, the silk cocoon vanished from the official histories. Imperial archives were sealed. Scholars dismissed the stories as dark fairy tales. And so, the truth of what happened to those women was lost. Or so everyone thought. History is full of secrets. But some refused to stay buried. no matter how deep the state digs the grave. For almost 1,300 years, the official amnesia held firm. The cocoon was just a ghost story, a dark fable whispered by old women. Then, in the 1970s, a group of academics found something inside a forgotten monastery. They were searching for Buddhist philosophical texts, a routine mission into the dust of the past. What they uncovered was something else entirely. They found a set of scrolls, locked away in a side chamber, not with the main library. The clay seals were different, stamped with an imperial insignia that had been obsolete for a millennium. The sound of one of those ancient seals cracking open in the hushed room must have been electric. The first historian carefully unrolled a manuscript of yellowed silk. The calligraphy was pristine, the ink still sharp and black against the fabric. It was not philosophy, it was not poetry, it was a witness account. It described, in the calm, steady hand of a court scribe, a public punishment, but the description was impossible. A fever dream, straight from the darkest corners of folklore. It detailed the methodical application of wet silk bands. It named names. It named Lady Jiang. For these academics, holding this scroll, the blood must have drained from their faces. The fable was staring back at them from the page, a ghost given flesh and ink. They frantically opened another sealed container. And another. They found not just one account, but several, each one a different piece of the same horrifying puzzle. One scroll was a technical manual. It was cold, precise, utterly devoid of emotion. It read like an engineer's notes on stress and torsion. It detailed the specific tensile strength of different silk weaves. It laid out the physics of drying fibers, calculating the rate of contraction based on the humidity of the air in the Great Hall. The chilling science behind the art of cruelty was laid bare. Another scroll was different, more mundane, and somehow more terrible. It was a simple supply ledger from the imperial household. It logged the exact number of finest quality silk bolts requisitioned from the imperial stores on specific dates. Beside each entry was a note. The notes were not for clothing or courtly gifts. They were for an exhortation ceremony. The names of the noblewomen, the ones whose official history said they died of sudden fevers or tragic accidents, were listed right there. It was a receipt for a soul. The sheer administrative banality of it was breathtaking. It was proof that the horror was not a rogue act of a mad empress, but a formalized, repeatable, and officially sanctioned procedure of the state. For the historians in that room, it was a moment of profound, terrible vindication. The whispers were true. The ghost story had a body count, documented in triplicate. They could almost hear the sounds described in the texts, the sharp rip of fabric, the shallow gasps for air, the quiet scratch of a scribe's brush documenting it all. The sanitized histories they had all studied were exposed as a carefully constructed lie. The empire had not just committed this atrocity, it had marshaled its entire bureaucratic might to murder the very memory of it. This discovery sent a shockwave through their world. The puzzle pieces of the Tang Dynasty, scattered for centuries, finally clicked into place. The sudden illnesses, the abrupt shifts in political power, the pervasive atmosphere of dread that later emperors struggled to dispel, it all made a new, terrifying kind of sense. The scrolls provided the dark engine that had been secretly driving the court. The scrolls proved it all. The victims were real people, their names and fates finally rescued from the state's forgery. The method was a calculated science of compression and despair. The Empress's cold psychology was visible in every precise instruction, every logistical detail for the public ceremonies. It was the complete, undeniable proof of a cruelty so specific it had been dismissed as unbelievable. But as the historians translated the final texts, a more chilling realization began to dawn on them. The scrolls documented the end of the physical practice, its banning and its burial from history. But the most terrifying discovery was not about the past. It was the understanding that while the cocoon itself is gone, the tactic it represents is timeless. And so we return to the silent, suffocating darkness. Inside the cocoon, the muffled gasps of the court have long since faded. The dry whisper of silk is over. All that remains is the frantic, hammering drum of her own blood in her ears, a desperate beat against the unyielding pressure. Every shallow sip of air she steals feels like a monumental victory, but she knows the walls are still closing in. She can feel the individual threads, 1,000 tiny garrotes, pulling tighter with every passing second as the last of the moisture evaporates from the fabric. Her bones ache with a pressure so profound it feels as if the weight of the entire empire is compressing her into a single point. But worse than the physical agony is the final, terrible clarity of understanding. She knows now this is not a punishment for a crime, it is a correction of an idea. The Empress is not just ending her life, she is disproving her existence. The very concept of her, a woman who held power through respect and not fear, is being collapsed into a singularity of helplessness. Her last sensation is not of dying. It is the chilling, absolute feeling of disappearing. Her human form gives way. Her identity, stripped, shredded, and scorned, is finally crushed out of existence. The final sound she perceives is the sharp, infinitesimal creak of a single silk fiber contracting into its final permanent place. Then, nothing. Outside, the court stares at a beautiful gleaming sculpture, a silent monument to a lesson they will never forget. The message is received. The Empress perfected a weapon that would outlive her dynasty by 1,000 years. The silk cocoon itself was banned, its memory buried, its records systematically erased. But the blueprint, the cold and brilliant logic that powered it, has never gone away. The technique is terrifying because it is so pure. You find the foundation of a person's identity. You discover the source of their deepest pride, their unassailable strength, and you turn it into the cage that will destroy them. You do not attack their weakness. You weaponize their strength. For the noblewomen of the Tang court, it was their flawless elegance, their untouchable status, their public presentation, all symbolized by the shimmering silk they wore. Wu Zetian took that armor and reforged it into a tool of suffocation. She did not merely execute them, she forced them to watch as their own identity, their own place in the world, became the agent of their murder. This is a form of warfare that needs no armies and no steel. It has simply changed its arena. The imperial court is now global. The malicious whispers are amplified into a deafening digital roar. Today we watch as a person's own words are meticulously woven into a shroud of public shame. We see an individual's history, their achievements, their very name, twisted into an accusation until they are publicly erased, turned into a shapeless object of scorn. The tools are more advanced. The silk is now made of light and information, but the central horror is precisely the same. It is the sound of a human being's identity being systematically ripped apart while the world is commanded to bear witness. The greatest act of power is not to kill an enemy. It is the ability to make them participate in their own erasure, to force them to suffocate on the very thing that once gave them breath.